Next up, we're joined by Brendan O'Meara, the host of the Creative Nonfiction podcast. Brendan has been an award-winning journalist for more than 15 years and is the author of 6 Weeks in Saratoga, How 3-Year-Old filly Rachel Alexandra beat the boys and became Horse of the Year. He is based in Eugene, Oregon, and is at work on a memoir about his father and baseball. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Whitney and Sugi, I am so thrilled to be here. I'm such a deep admirer of the work you guys do with the podcast and your writing, and just to be in conversation with you here on your home turf is a thrill, and I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we really appreciate your making the time. And today we're talking about writing and talking about nonfiction in an age of no facts. Depressing. Your show began in 2013, early in the second Obama administration, and one could state obvious truths back then without feeling gaslit by elected officials or major news channels. And when you were first starting out as a podcaster, you talked about art and truth and their importance and their coexistence. So how are you thinking back then about the role of facts on your new show about creative nonfiction?
Yeah, it's facts to me are just, a given. It's one of those things where when you have nonfiction in the title of your show, or when you purport to be a reporter of the news, whether it be sports or hard news or feature news, you just, facts is the wireframe on which we hang the true story. And to me, there was just always never an argument that would be an issue to interpret facts. Like when Bronwyn Dickey, the great writer and reporter who's been on the show several times, we got into a little spat, not a spat, but we were just talking. She went on a rant about the lifespan of a fact and that whole thing. And she's like, no, like a fact is a fact. There is no room for interpretation. There are certain things that are true. So when I start a podcast, of course, where I'm interviewing people about the art and craft of telling true stories, facts are just kind of a given. And the people who are on the show have an understanding of that. So it's never been something I've really had to wrestle with. It's always been a given, which is nice. And but we can always talk about how, memory can kind of, put a filter over fact, which can lead to some artistic freedom, artistic liberties, and certainly can lead to some great explorations. But I think, so long as the sun is rising in the east, I think we can all agree on that. And that's sort of a core tenet of a CNF pod.
But there have been, I think back to the different scandals. And it's important that it's a scandal when it happens, right? That when somebody like James Fry, gets busted for not, being honest about what his memoir was about, or, I've heard people criticize, In Cold Blood for having, really been not exactly reported in the way that Truman Capote claimed that he would go and talk to those guys in their prison, then come home and write down the conversations. Did he really, was he really reporting on what they exactly said, or was he basically writing, dialogue for them? That is part of the discussion about what is creative nonfiction and what is not.
Yeah, exactly. And he purported to have like a photographic memory, which is, just maybe he did to some extent, but I'm sure, he was more on the, certainly on the artistic liberty side of the reporting, where if something sounded better on the page to him, that was more important than the actual, maybe the actual date of something, or if in fact, the Clutter family, had, if in fact the Spartan patriarch of the family really did eat apples, just an apple every morning, like who knows what he had for breakfast, but we have to trust him based on the account he wrote. But yeah, that's just it. And unfortunately, I guess I haven't had anyone on the show where I've really had to, challenge the veracity of their reporting or their writing. But we've had those talks with memory, and oftentimes I love when, and the best memoirs to me, and when I get into talking to people about that and those creative liberties, it's the people who can turn that camera inwards, can be a reporter on their own life, and ask themselves the objective questions as if they were writing just a long feature about somebody else, but that long feature just happens to be them. And I think David Carr writes about that beautifully in a conversation I just had with Lee Gutkin, the founder of the Creative Nonfiction magazine. He's written a lot of narrative, immersive journalism, and his latest book is a memoir where he really did almost take himself to task the way he would somebody else looking outward. He just had the courage to turn it inwards and do that kind of inward research and inward reporting. So I've been lucky that I haven't had like a James Fry locking horns type thing. I welcome the day that might come, because that might be kind of fun for listeners. But as of yet, I haven't had to wrestle with that yet. And as someone who's not a confrontational person, so far I applaud that, and actually kind of I like that I haven't had to go toe to toe, because confrontation is not my forte.
When you're interviewing people, do you feel like, I don't know, now versus back in 2013, it makes sense that people would be worried about or thinking more about how their own judgment relates to the judgment of people who they're talking to? I guess I'm interested in whether the writers you're talking to and interviewing now are worrying about different things than they were back in 2013, or if it's sort of the same.
I think the craft matters are largely, the same. Because I try to at least have some degree of predictability to what I'm. So, there's an expectation on the listeners, and I don't want to stray too far from what they're used to, in a sense, because they come to the show to maybe, learn a new trick, not a trick, but maybe a new skill that they can apply to their own work. So I don't want to necessarily go rogue off, the things that I think people have come to enjoy about it, or what I think they enjoy, because largely I follow my own taste anyway, and I just hope that aligns with the audience, and to an extent, and I think that's operated well to date. So yeah, but even going back then, I'm thinking, who the real early run of the show, and the audio quality was just like, Nokia cell phones or something.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. You don't want to listen to early shows of fiction, nonfiction.
Aw, we weren't like the Tin Can podcast. We were all right.
No.
Yeah, mine was definitely Tin Can. I posted in a picture on my Instagram stories about what my old rig used to look like, and I had this a little stand of some kind. I put a rubber band around a landline phone with the speaker facing this little cheap snowball microphone, and I put that on speaker. And so I'm kind of like talking into the phone, the speaker's going into the mic, and it's just, it's terrible. But it's just this idea that, anyone can do this if you just want to. And then you can level up your gear, of course, going from there. But yeah, just a lot of the people I talked to early on, we're talking like a Brian Mockenhop, who's a great war correspondent. He's written beautifully about PTSD in, The Living and the Dead, a former Byliner original. And so in talking to him, it's just like, how do you have the courage to really dive deep in people's lives and feel like you're not, you're trying to be empathetic and sympathetic to somebody's story and responsible with their story, asking questions that really probe, but doing it in a respectful way, knowing that you're going to be, essentially you're drawing out their story so you can tell a better story, and in effect kind of buoy your own journalistic brand, if you will. It's the whole ethical thing with Janet Malcolm's and the journalist and the murderer. There's always that sort of give and take. So, talking to people about that. And then as this show gained a little bit of traction, talked to a lot of sports writers, how about they, just, having that courage to go and ask those questions. And it's a lot of the same things. And I think maybe it's just, there's a bit more assuredness behind it after you've been doing it for, almost 9 years and 230 interviews. You start to, through the repetition of it, you get a bit more skilled about how you go about asking those questions. And I think that applies every bit to a lot of the writers who were doing it then, and they're doing it now. But back then, maybe they were working on long magazine features, and then they're getting into their first books. So you can kind of see the growth of a lot of these writers too, which is very exciting for me.
You got your start in local journalism, including covering horse racing at the is it Saratogian? Am I saying that right?
The Saratogian, yeah.
That's very cool. Which is, the site of some of the most prominent horse racing in the country, and not to mention Yaddo. Speaking of writing, these days, though you're the opinion page editor at the Eugene Register Guard, I used to think of local newsrooms as feeders or incubators for certain kinds of essayists and magazine writers, but now there aren't nearly as many of those sorts of jobs, right? How does the change in local journalism affect the future of literary nonfiction, and its relationship to fact?
Yeah, I used to have that same exact, approach there, where it felt like, you cut your teeth in these very small newsrooms. My very first gig was in this very, very small newsroom in Henderson, North Carolina, where I was a little sports writer, 2-man sports team. We're covering, maybe 2 games apiece, me and the editor, and we're laying out the pages as well. And so we're just really in the thick of it, and you're just writing, you're just churn. And with the idea being like, okay, I'm going to report like hell on these local stories, cover these high school preps as if it's the World Series, because to a lot of them, it kind of is the World Series. And you kind of have to put your, be like, yeah, this is big time for a lot of these kids. And so you treat it that way. And then, of course, you just kind of, you think about maybe getting to a bigger market, in which case you get more ambitious with your storytelling. And but unfortunately, as the newspaper industry has contracted and newsrooms have contracted, there's no longer the editorial coaching that you can get if you want to write a nice ambitious feature. Whereas you might be covering a few games, and then maybe you and your editor can have a little meeting and be like, okay, I want to write a 1,500 word feature that's taking a deeper dive, and I talk to 10 or 12 people. There just really isn't that kind of, okay, let's work on this for a few weeks and then go back and forth with line edits and restructure it, move things here and there, use dialogue over quotes, all this kind of thing that can really start to level up the artistry of the nonfiction you're looking to tell, and also just adds a greater creative muscle. And as I was going through, I just never had that. We just never had the time or the manpower to have that kind of relationship where you felt like you could start to, level up. So in a way, you have to just kind of take that bull by the horns if you really want that, and grab like a best American sports writing volume, RIP. Unfortunately, this is the last year of it. Or, best American short stories or travel writing, thumb through that and be like, okay, this is the kind of work I want to do. Let's kind of deconstruct this, go to the notable selections and see the 100 bylines that are there, and the magazines and the small journals that are actually open to publishing that kind of work. And then you're like, okay, I like this kind of work. I like doing this kind of work. Now I just need to try to place it. And so you read it and deconstruct it. And then maybe you find a nice writing group where you can kind of workshop this thing. Whereas that might have taken place in a small newsroom or even a bigger newsroom back in the day. It's just, I can attest to it in the newsroom I'm in now, and in a Gannett newspaper, no one has the time or the bandwidth to dive in and give you, really work on like structuring a piece, try to make it as good as possible, but then it's on to the next thing. Whereas maybe before you could start to lean in and get more, have a bit more air underneath the wings of a story. But these days you almost have to take that agency on your own. But at least when you're in that smaller newsroom, you're learning the skills and the chops to do a better reported essay or to do a longer feature when you're ready to do it on your own. Because unfortunately, it is on you to kind of build your own community these days, because the community baked into these newsrooms now, it's too frenetic and too small to give you the kind of coaching that you really need or desire.
So I just want to go back for a second too. We were talking a little bit before about artistic liberties, as I think you put it. And I've always been a real traditionalist in terms of fact and creative nonfiction, which I think is partly the result of my fairly square nature. And then being trained as a reporter in newsrooms where facts are not malleable. And I just can't get my head around the idea of creating a composite character or flipping the order of events the way that I might do when writing a short story. But I know that there are lots of creative nonfiction writers who are comfortable with that. And you were both trained in newsrooms too. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that and how you've dealt with it in your own work.
Yeah, this is I know a lot of authors, and I read a lot of memoir for the podcast too. And oftentimes they, at least if they're going to take some of those liberties, whether it be a composite character or if they know they have to fudge something for one reason or another, most of the time, at least there's an author note at the beginning. Be like, listen, in this area, I needed this person's name is changed, or this person is an amalgam. In which case, like, okay, I get it. At least you're being transparent. But as a nonfiction guy and as someone who came through journalism, like, to me, that's fiction. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that, but just call it what it is. And one of my favorite memoirs this year is Rose Anderson's of The Heart and Other Monsters. And she comes out right and says, like, she basically made up entire sections in there. And so it's like, okay, well, she's coming out and saying that. But then when you have to start wondering, okay, what else is made up? If you made this up, what else can I trust that the rest of this is nonfiction? And even in the memoir I'm writing right now, the incarnation that it's currently at, I'm actually not comfortable calling it nonfiction because I had to imagine, because my parents weren't very forthright in my reporting of them. They just didn't want to talk. My parents split up, and very sensitive issue. And so they just didn't want to be forthcoming, especially about their courtship and everything. So I kind of, even through what I was able to piece together through their own memories when they would tell me anything, I kind of had to imagine what that was like, even though what I imagined is pretty spot on. Uh, and also, I changed, at least in the last draft, I changed my main position on the field from shortstop to catcher, because my dad was always a catcher. I did some catching, and in the end, I actually do become a catcher. And so the title of the book is "The Tools of Ignorance," which is just a nickname for the catcher's gear. But the fact that as a competitive player, I was a shortstop the whole time, but the book kind of had more resonance to me for me to be a catcher. My sister was a catcher. My dad was a catcher. So it's almost this generational position of donning the tools and being behind the plate and calling the shots. So, like I said, I did some catching, but I wasn't what I would identify as a catcher, especially like during the days when I was going up and playing up into college. If I do use an author's note and say, listen, I changed my position because I think it's more artful to be like, is that still nonfiction? I don't think it is. Someone else might. And so I'm in a murky waters. Do I call this a novel, even though that's kind of the only thing I change, and everything else, all the names are real, everything else is real, no composites. So it's a funny dialogue I need to have, or do I just straight up say that this is a novel? I changed this. It's a novel that kind of reads like a nonfiction memoir, but my nonfiction bones and my nonfiction DNA really doesn't want to say this is a memoir when I know for a fact I changed things that are verifiably.
The problem is that when you make it a novel, then people could say, well, then I actually think the plot should go this way. And you can like maybe you should have this happen to you when you're in 7th grade instead of 9th grade. That would work better narratively. And suddenly you're like, you can't explain like, well, I can't have it be the way because I'm writing nonfiction. So I have to deal with the plot the way it was given to me. And I have to, then you sort of open up a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. And if I go down the novel route, it's just like, well, if you're going to make up certain things, like, well, don't be so boxed into this. And now turn it loose, man. And it's just like, ugh. So
you don't want to do that. Don't.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times too, it's like my creative liberty was more of omission too, when I was calling myself a catcher, which was not entirely false. But when I was in games where I might describe myself making a play in the field, I just say like I made a play, and so it was just more of a lie by omission and not necessarily making anything up. So it's a weird sort of muddy waters I'm trying to tread through there. And I certainly don't want to, I don't know, I don't want to violate any rules, and especially since I sort of hang my, as gross as the sound, sort of hang my brand on nonfiction.
I mean, Sugi, have you heard about this thing that's going on with Caliphate, that this incredibly popular
the Rukmini Callimachi podcast that came out of the New York Times, which is now being fact checked, I guess.
It's been withdrawn.
Did they actually? Oh, I missed that development. I knew when they were investigating it. Wow.
Yeah, I just saw that. I'm not familiar with the backstory of that, but I did see some headlines where like significant parts or the entire thing was just withdrawn. Yeah.
Wow. Good Lord. Well, I mean, it's interesting to get this window into your thinking about it. And I know I'm sure for our listeners, it'll be a treat both to check out your extended conversations about this and other sort of related craft topics on the CNF podcast, and also to, when your book comes out, to find out what it is called.
I know. We'll see. I mean, to be determined.
Listeners, don't miss the Creative Nonfiction podcast, and you can find links to some of Brendan's own writing in our show notes and also on that podcast website. Take care.
Thank you so much.